So from the mouth, we go to the oro and the laryngopharynx. Um, this allows food and fluids to pass into the esophagus and then air into the trachea. We've had the pharynx before. The oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, these are the ones that are lined with stratified squamous epithelium, and they also contain a large amount of mucus glands. Now, I showed you before when we just looked at the general overview of the GI tract that you've got two layers of muscle. You've got the inner longitudinal muscles, and then you have the outer pharyngeal constrictors. So once we go through the pharynx, now we're going to enter the esophagus. We've already covered the larynx, and so we understand how the epiglottis folds down over the glottis, so the food can then slide down the back and into the esophagus. So that's where we're at here. This is figure 23.12 in the text. And so the esophagus is a muscular tube. It's going from the laryngopharynx to the stomach. And this joins the stomach at what's called the cardiac orifice, and I'll show you that here in just a bit. Now, when it comes to this, it comes to the esophagus, once again, we've got those same four layers that we saw before. We've got the esophageal mucosa. Now, this time it's non-keratinized, but it's still stratified squamous epithelium. And typically, the empty esophagus is then folded and sort of flattens when food goes through it. But anyway, glands secrete mucus as that bolus of food moves down the esophagus. Here's the really cool part that I think anyway. When we start in the esophagus up here at the top, this is all skeletal muscle. And if you remember back from those first couple chapters, skeletal muscle is under conscious control. So we decide when we swallow. As we move down into the middle third, we start to switch from skeletal into smooth. So we lose control. And then finally down at the bottom third, that's all smooth muscle. So it goes from skeletal, a mix, and then to smooth muscle, and we're no longer in control of the swallowing process. Okay, as far as the other layers, again, like we saw before, we have a mucosa, we've got a submucosa, we've got a muscularis with the two layers here, the circularis on the inside, the longitudinal on the outside, and then we have the connective tissue on the outside, the adventia in this case, okay? Yeah, we'll go with this. So the digestive process actually starts in the mouth. Okay, so food is ingested. We know that. That's bringing food into the system. Mechanical digestion begins. We start chewing. Propulsion is initiated. We swallow. But here's the thing. Salivary amylase begins the chemical breakdown of the starches from our mouth. So the pharynx and the esophagus are simply conduits to food, for the food to pass through into the stomach. You know, when it comes to swallowing, there are over 22 separate muscle groups that play a role in you swallowing. So this is such a coordinated effort between the tongue and the soft palate and the pharynx, the esophagus, and those 22 separate groups to get you to actually swallow this bolus of food. So it's kind of a big deal. Anyway, once we hit the esophagus, peristalsis is going to move the food, and actually that's actually going to start in the pharynx, but then it hits in the esophagus and it makes its way down into the stomach. This is figure 23.13, and it just shows what's taking place. The part I like on this, okay, so we've got our bolus of food, but look at how the epiglottis right here folds down to cover the glottis, because remember, this glottis is the opening. So we're going to fold over so that food goes right down the backside, and then it's going to spring back open. Okay, and there's my bolus of food with my muscles constricting behind it to help it down through. There is a sphincter muscle before we enter the stomach. Okay, this is the gastropharyngeal sphincter, and that allows us to move into the stomach. Now, the stomach itself, take a look at this. In the stomach, we are going to see a chemical breakdown of proteins begin, and the food is converted over to what's called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, chyme. Now, there are different regions around here, obviously. We said something earlier about the cardia. Here's the cardia region right here. We've got the fundus. A fundus is actually a curved top or something. So fundus is that dome shaped. This isn't just a stomach term. The uterus also has a fundus. The body, you can see from my pictures down here, the body is most of this down here. And then we go down in this region. Here's the pyloric region, the pylorus, and the pylorus then is continuous with the duodenum, and it goes through the pyloric sphincter. So this muscle here is what keeps food inside of your stomach. Some other things, we got the greater curvature, and this is that convex lateral surface. Then we have the lesser curvature on the inside. That's a medial surface. We have what are called omentums, O-M-E-N-T-U-M. Omentum are just a layer of tissue, and we have a lesser omentum, and it runs from this lesser curvature here to the liver, and it sort of anchors everything together. And then the greater omentum, that one sort of drapes inferiorly from the greater curvature to the small intestine. So that's how we're hooking tissues up here. Okay. Nerve supply to the stomach, you've got to have sympathetic and parasympathetic. I don't know if you remember this, but remember, parasympathetic is resting and digesting. So that's the one that kicks in when we actually have food. But in certain situations, when we need to get into that fight or flight, that's when the sympathetic needs to come in and shut this stuff down. So we see both. As far as blood supply, we use the celiac trunk and then corresponding veins. And then we use what's called the hepatic portal system, which is pretty cool. I'll show you that here in a little bit. That's basically taking the nutrients from the stomach and running them into the liver. And again, I'll show you that probably in the next video. Okay. Here's a microscopic anatomy of the stomach. Okay. Oh, I forgot to tell you, look, we added an oblique layer. Take a look right there. So here's my longitudinal layer coming down the esophagus. It continues down. On the inside of that, there's my circularis. That's the one going round and round in here. And look, we added that third layer of muscle. There's the oblique. And that helps with the churning of food, because that's really what we're doing here. We're churning and mixing and pummeling the food physically. And it's that layer there that really helps with that. So we're breaking the food down into smaller and smaller fragments. Now we're ready for the microscopic anatomy. In the microscopic anatomy, we have epithelium lining, an epithelial lining, and it's composed of goblet cells. Obviously, we have to have a lot of mucus here. And the mucus here contains an alkaline substance. We need a bicarbonate trapped in that mucus. Otherwise, the fluids from the stomach are going to go through the mucus, and we're going to start seeing sores develop in our stomach lining. Now, from there, we've got gastric pits. That's what you're looking at here. These are gastric pits going down. They contain the gastric glands that secrete the gastric juices, and then also the mucus is secreted from there, and then gastrin. So there's kind of some cool things there. When it comes to okay, so see where I'm at right here. So there's my gastric pits going down. We're going to look at parietal cells and chief cells down here, because otherwise these are just epithelium, epithelium, epithelium. That's what we've got going down, but we have some others. Enteroendocrine cells, we're not going to worry about. Those are producing some hormones, so you're fine with that. But down here we've got our chief cells, and there's my parietal cells. And then in between those are all the epithelials. Okay, so the chief cells down here at the bottom. These things are the ones that are going to produce pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is activated by 2-pepsin. So pepsinogen becomes pepsin, and it's activated by hydrochloric acid. We always think that we have hydrochloric acid in our stomach and that breaks everything down. That's not the case. There are pictures out on the internet. You can find this. I saw a really good one. I wish I had it here, but it's not included in the slideshow, and I'm sorry for that. But it shows a piece of meat in a vial of hydrochloric acid and how it doesn't break down. And then they show a vial or a piece of meat in a vial of pepsinogen, and that doesn't break down. And then finally, they have a vial that is pepsin. So that's the pepsinogen plus the hydrochloric acid, and the meat is just dissolved. You got to remember PEP stands for peptide. Peptide bonds are the ones we find between our amino acids. That's back to your general biology class. So your chief cells produce pepsinogen. Your parietal cells produce hydrochloric acid, and the two together make up your stomach acid, or your stomach juices that break down protein. So we started amylase in our mouth, and now we've got proteins in our stomach. And oh, by the way, those enteroendocrine cells, they secrete things like gastrin. Gastrin's a hormone that tells your stomach, hey, it's time to turn on, and actually your whole system. CCK, which is close cystokinin, That's one that tells your gallbladder to secrete. And there are others in there, but anyway, it's all part of the GI system. Okay. Anyway, so when it comes to, this is kind of cool. So this is just showing my pepsinogen coming out of my chief cells and my hydrochloric acid coming out of my parietal cells, and that forms my pepsin, which is going to break things down. But now, when it comes to your stomach lining, this is some of the harshest conditions in your digestive tract. So in order to keep it from digesting itself, we create that mucosal barrier. It's a thick coat of bicarbonate-rich mucus on the stomach wall. The other thing, on the walls of the stomach, the cells have tight junctions because we can't let your gastric juices get into those. We have to be impermeable to all of this, okay? Otherwise, we're going to end up with some real issues. But the cool thing is, if I remember right, your damaged epithelial cells are replaced very quickly. We always talk about, you get a new skeleton every 10 years and you get this every so many years. If I remember right, I think you get a new stomach from the lining anyway, the mucosa. I think you get a new one about every 2 weeks, if I'm remembering that right. So I think I am, but I think it's about every 2 weeks. Okay, so in the stomach, we're going to hold ingested food. We're going to degrade it both physically, remember that churning with that extra layer of muscles, and chemically. So we're going to have catabolic, some catabolic reactions going on to break it down. We're going to then deliver the chyme, because that's what the food has now become, which is food plus digestive juices, into the small intestine. And then we're going to digest the proteins with pepsin. And then there's some other things that we're secreting along the way. One of them is like vitamin B12. We absorb vitamin B12 through the stomach. So, yep, that's where I wanted to end. So that gives you everything up through the stomach. So that gives you the esophagus down into the stomach. And hopefully that gives you a good overview of what's taking place, at least to this point. Don't forget, we started the digestion of our starches, and now we have spent a good amount of time digesting our proteins. We still have the rest of the carbohydrates, the fats, and the nucleic acids to go, and we'll pick those up real soon.